Dementors are integral to Harry's third year at Hogwarts, and even play a role throughout the rest of the overarching story. But since these evil beings are so crucial to the plot, it made me wonder, just how accurate was the movie during Harry's first encounter with a Dementor on the Hogwarts Express? Well, today, that's a part of what we're covering as I'm continuing my scene-by-scene analysis of The Prisoner of Azkaban. I'll be revealing every change from the time that Harry met up with Ron and Hermione in the Leaky Cauldron to when Harry had his dark encounter with a Dementor and was saved by Professor Lupin. Trust me, there's a lot in today's episode that you won't want to miss. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 33 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, Harry Potter Edition. This is the show where I take the Harry Potter movies and compare them to the books, finding all the differences along the way. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a shout out to this commenter from a previous video. Each week, I highlight one of the top comments from a past episode, so be sure to share your thoughts down below when you're done watching. Per usual, I'll cover all the changes across the four major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But first, let's recap what happened during these scenes in the movie so it's fresh on our mind for the analysis. Picking up from where we left off last week with Harry taming his monster book, we see him head out of his room the next day and down into the main area of the Leaky Cauldron. There he sees Ron and Hermione, who are arguing over Hermione's new cat, and then the two friends spot Harry and greet him. Ron begins to tell him about Egypt, but gets cut off as the rest of the Weasley family arrives, and Mr. Weasley pulls Harry aside to have a private chat. Mr. Weasley then goes on to tell Harry all about Sirius Black and why he's escaped from Azkaban. The movie then cuts to the next scene as they have boarded the Hogwarts Express, and the trio take a compartment with someone already in it, as all the others are already full. Harry closes the door and tells Ron and Hermione about what Mr. Weasley told him about Sirius Black, and then suddenly the train stops and the lights go out. Things get really cold, and the trio watches as a strange cloaked figure floats to their door and opens it. Suddenly, the cloaked figure begins to almost suck the life out of Harry, but thankfully, the other person who had been sleeping in their compartment gets up and casts a spell that drives the creature away. Harry passes out, and then the movie cuts to when he wakes up at a later time, and all the lights are back on, with the stranger, who Hermione pointed out earlier as Professor Lupin, handing Harry some chocolate. Lupin tells Harry that the cloaked figure was a Dementor, and then he leaves to go speak with the conductor. Ron and Hermione then fill Harry in on what happened, telling him that he was the only one who passed out. The movie then fades to Hogwarts itself as the students are gathered in the Great Hall, and Dumbledore gives his usual opening remarks, telling the students about their new teachers, Professor Lupin and Rubeus Hagrid. Then the movie cuts once again to the final moments of this week's scenes, as we watch the Gryffindors try to get into their common room, but the fat lady in the portrait is trying to show them her singing. Eventually, she lets them in, and then the scene ends with us watching Harry and the other boys in his dorm goof off as they eat some magical candy. And now that we've gone over everything we're covering today for these scenes, let's head into our first three categories of characters, timeline, and location. First, for characters, we're only missing one person, Florian Fortescue. This lovely ice cream parlor owner really doesn't have too important of a role, but he is mentioned during Harry's time traversing Diagon Alley, and therefore he gets a shout out here. Other than that, we have a few changes regarding characters we see in the movie, but who have talking parts or some other involvement in the book. First, we have Madame Pomfrey and Professor McGonagall, who speak with Harry, Ron, and Hermione upon their arrival at Hogwarts. We also have Hagrid, who talks to the trio, Neville and Ginny, who are more involved on the train than what the movie shows, and finally, Draco, Crabbe, and Goyle, who all make an appearance on the train as well. But as you know, we'll cover these details in the plot changes. Next, for timeline, the movie removed Harry's time staying at the Leaky Cauldron before he met up with Ron and Hermione. He got there about a week before they did, and therefore he spent a few days walking around Diagon Alley, saying hey to the other classmates, and just people watching the wizards and witches coming and going. I totally understand why this in-between time was removed, but in just a moment I'll go over some of the details that are omitted from this time, as there is some brief foreshadowing on these pages. Finally, before getting to those plot changes, we have location, which is pretty simple this week as we're only missing Diagon Alley. Other than that, everything is pretty accurate. There's a brief removal of King's Cross, but technically we do see platform 9 3/4 for a few seconds, so I can't say that they removed it entirely. Now before I go on, I just want to remind you that I can't analyze every word spoken in the book, because that would take forever, and it's impossible for a movie to remain 100% accurate to book dialogue. However, if you are looking to relive these moments for yourself and get those details, I'd highly encourage you to check out the audiobooks on Audible. You can use my link in the description to claim your free trial, which gets you one free audiobook and supports the channel at the same time. Anyway, on that note, let's get into the plot changes. To start, our first change directly relates to our timeline issue, as Harry spent several days wandering around the Leaky Cauldron and Diagon Alley. And because of this, we miss out on a few details, some of which foreshadow later parts of the book. So here's what we miss. We learn that Harry had no desire to wander out into the Muggle world, which would break his promise to Fudge, because life at the Leaky Cauldron was better than anything he'd experienced in the real world. He ate breakfast each day in the pub, watching the passers-by and taking in the strange creatures who came in and out of the establishment. Every once in a while, he would go to Diagon Alley and do his homework outside of Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor, and Florian himself would help Harry with his homework. Plus, he gave Harry a free sundae about every half hour. We also learn that Harry had to exercise some extreme self-control as he withdrew money from Gringotts and had no one around to tell him not to buy stuff. He almost purchased a new set of gobstones, which is a wizarding game, a lifelike moving version of the galaxy and a glass ball, and maybe most tempting of all, a firebolt broomstick, which was only priced upon request, which means it's expensive. In the book, we get a glimpse at how insane this broomstick is, as Harry reads the details on the sign next to the broom. The tail consisted of individually hand-selected and crafted birch twigs, the broom had an unbreakable braking charm put on it, and it could go 0 to 150 miles per hour in 10 seconds. Which is insane to think of a child on that without any sort of equipment holding them down. I'm not sure the physics of that check out. But anyway, along with this shopping, Harry ran into Dean, Neville, and Seamus as they came in during different days with their families to pick up school supplies. Then we come to our next change, which is still involving these days Harry had without his two best friends. But I am marking it as a separate change from what I just mentioned, since it is a more lengthy moment in the book. And this moment is Harry's trip to Flourish and Blotts to pick up his book for divination. After getting his robes lengthened since they were a couple inches too short, Harry looked at his list and saw he still needed a few new books, including 2 for 2 new classes he would be taking this year: Divination and Care of Magical Creatures. To his relief, Harry noticed that the book he needed for Care of Magical Creatures was the Monster Book of Monsters, which Hagrid had already sent him. So Harry walked into Flourish and Blotts and spoke to the manager, who asked him if he was picking up his school books, and then quickly hurried to a large cage at the front of the shop, which contained about 100 copies of the Monster Book of Monsters. They were all fighting and tearing each other to pieces, with pages flying everywhere. Quickly, Harry told the manager that he already had that one, and the man was extremely relieved to not have to reach inside the cage yet again. He then told Harry that this is one of the most ridiculous books he's ever had to stock, and it's almost as bad as when they purchased 200 copies of the Invisible Book of Invisibility. He told Harry that they never found those books. Harry then showed the wizard what book he needed, which was for divination, and was directed to the right section. Harry then looked around the books and saw one titled Death Omens, which had a giant black dog on the front. The store manager then saw Harry looking at it and told him not to go reading that, or else he'll start seeing death omens everywhere he goes. But Harry was more intrigued at the dog on the front, as it looked eerily similar to the dog he saw the other night before the night bus picked him up. But snapping out of his trance, he told the manager the other books he needed and was quickly checked out and on his way with his new books. And now we can head into our next change, which is that Harry doesn't meet Ron and Hermione in the Leaky Cauldron, like the movie shows, but rather in Diagon Alley. And their conversation with each other is more extensive at this point. The movie keeps it quite simple, and Harry quickly gets pulled aside by Mr. Weasley. But in the book, Ron asks Harry if he really blew up his aunt, and he says that he didn't mean to. But to the movie's credit, they did take these lines and move them to when the trio boards the train later in our scenes. Anyway, in the book, Ron and Hermione inform Harry that he can come with them to King's Cross tomorrow, as Hermione and the Weasleys are staying the night at the Leaky Cauldron. Harry asked if his friends had finished their shopping, and Ron showed him his brand new wand, which he was able to buy because of Mr. Weasley winning the 700 galleons earlier that summer. Then Harry pointed out all of Hermione's books, as she had way more than the boys, and he asked her if she was planning on sleeping at all this year. Hermione quickly changed the subject and told the boys that she had 10 galleons left over, which she got from her parents as a birthday present. She then told them that she wanted to get a pet because both Harry and Ron had one. Which brings us to our next change, which is that the movie completely omits the detail of how Hermione obtains Crookshanks. In the movie, Harry sees Scabbers and the new cat running through the halls of the Leaky Cauldron, which leads him to his friends. But in the book, we actually witness Hermione get her new pet. After Hermione said she wanted a pet, Ron mentioned that Scabbers hasn't seemed well since Egypt, and Hermione suggested that he can get something to help him at the magical creature shop. So the trio headed to the store, and Ron spoke to the witch at the counter. This is where we learn something interesting, which is that magical creatures have magical abilities. I know this seems obvious, but I guess when you think of a wizard having a pet rat, you think it's just a rat. Well, the witch at the counter asked if Scabbers has any abilities, and Ron couldn't think of any. This further foreshadows the fact that Scabbers isn't normal. The witch then tells Ron that a rat should live for 3 to 4 years, and Scabbers has been around a lot longer than that. But she still gives him a tonic to help with Scabbers' current indisposition. However, before Ron could pay for it, a red cat jumped on top of Ron's head and then onto the counter, spitting and hissing at Scabbers. Scabbers quickly jumped off the counter and ran away, and it took Ron and Harry nearly 10 minutes to catch him outside. But eventually, after catching him, Hermione came out with not an owl like she said she would be getting, but Crookshanks, the very cat that had jumped on top of Ron's head and gone after Scabbers. And now maybe you understand why Ron is so against this cat specifically. Anyway, moving on, we come to our next change, which is another omission, as the movie cuts straight from Harry talking with Mr. Weasley to them on the Hogwarts Express. Well, Harry does talk with Mr. Weasley, but not at the Leaky Cauldron. Plus, before he has the talk, we have Harry's night with the Weasleys and Hermione, which includes dinner and Harry eavesdropping on a conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Weasley. First, regarding the dinner, there's one detail which I think is worth mentioning, and that is that Mr. Weasley informs the group that the Ministry of Magic will be sending cards for them to take to King's Cross the following morning. Everyone is confused and asks why, to which Mr. Weasley tries to make up some excuse, but we know the real reason is because the Ministry is trying to protect Harry. But after dinner comes the real important part of this omitted night at the Cauldron, because as Harry walked through the halls, he overheard Mr. and Mrs. Weasley having an intense conversation about himself. Of course, since it was about him, he couldn't help but listen. And it's during this conversation that he learns the truth about Sirius Black and why the Ministry thinks he escaped. Mr. Weasley is trying to tell Mrs. Weasley that they must tell Harry, even though the Ministry doesn't want them to. But Mrs. Weasley, per usual, just wants to protect Harry and keep him as innocent as possible. Now, before I move on to the next day, there are a couple things I wanted to mention briefly that are mixed into these last few pages. First, we learn Percy is head boy at Hogwarts. And second, J.K. Rowling continues to build out Ron's greatest weakness, which is his insecurity with his family's money. After Harry asks Mr. Weasley if they've caught Black yet, Ron asks his dad if there will be a reward for catching him, and he adds that it would be nice for them to get their hands on some more gold. It's a brief moment in the book, but it really goes to show how the money they won over the summer has quickly gone to Ron's head. But now let's get back to the changes and look at the next one on our list, which is a smaller one that I kind of already mentioned, and it's that Mr. Weasley does have a talk with Harry, but he does it at King's Cross right before they board the train. Plus, he technically doesn't tell Harry anything. Before he can, Harry informs him that he already heard their conversation the previous night, and therefore Mr. Weasley need not break his promise to the Ministry and tell Harry anything. Next, we have 3 omitted details from their time on the train before the Dementor arrived. First, after Harry fills Ron and Hermione in on what he learned about Sirius Black the night before, a whistling noise started coming from Harry's bag. He then takes out the sneakoscope Ron had bought him, and Ron claims it was cheap and probably just doesn't work. But I personally think it is going off because of either Professor Lupin, who is eavesdropping on their conversation, or Scabbers, who we really know isn't Scabbers at all, and probably was feeling awkward as they talked about Sirius Black right in front of him. The second detail we don't get is their conversation about Hogsmeade. Ron and Hermione are shocked that Harry won't be going, but then Hermione says that maybe it's for the best that he doesn't leave the castle, given the circumstances. Ron, however, is upset and tells Harry to ask McGonagall or someone else to let him go. Lastly, the third detail we missed before our Dementor encounter is another encounter with someone who might be worse than a Dementor. Draco Malfoy. Keeping up with his tradition, Draco and his goons, Crabbe and Goyle, show up at Harry's compartment to pick a fight. But what keeps them from doing so is actually Lupin in the corner. Although he seems to be asleep, Draco spots him and asks who it is, to which Harry replied, "New teacher." At this, Draco took his minions and left. And now we have come to the all-important Dementor attack. The first change here is that Ron, Harry, Hermione, and Lupin weren't the only ones in their compartment when it happened. We read in the book that after all the lights went out, which made it impossible for them to see by the way, a person stumbled into their compartment and fell down. Harry instinctively knew who it was and pulled up none other than Neville Longbottom. Shortly after Neville arrived, Ginny came in as well and joined their group. The next change we have here is that Professor Lupin actually was awake before the Dementor arrived. You see, shortly after Neville and Ginny joined their group, Lupin got up and told them all to be quiet. He then lit a flame in his hand and went to the door, but before he could open it, it began to open on its own. Then, floating there in the doorway, illuminated by Lupin's flame, was a Dementor. The description of the Dementor is actually quite accurate to the movie version, and I think the movie did a fantastic job with these floating creatures. In fact, this scene with the Dementor approaching the door and opening it is one of the best scenes in the whole movie, in my opinion. The book version of the attack itself is actually quite similar, with Harry quickly passing out after the Dementor started sucking the life out of him, but then when he wakes up, he is of course surrounded by Ginny and Neville as well, and we learn that Ginny was in the corner almost as sick and bad as Harry was. This of course is because she is the only other one out of those in the compartment who has experienced something horrible in their life, so the Dementors affected her pretty badly as well, although she didn't pass out. The others then filled Harry in on what happened and told him that Lupin tried to get the Dementor to leave by telling it that none of them were hiding Sirius Black under their cloaks. Then, when it wouldn't leave, Lupin muttered something under his breath and a silvery white light shot out and sent the Dementor away. Now, the next thing we see in the movie is a transition shot of the carriages taking the students up to the castle, and this is accurate, but the movie cut out a decent amount before the feast. First, in the movie, Draco teases Harry while they're in the Great Hall, but in the book, he does it on the steps outside of Hogwarts as the students walked into the castle. He wanted to make fun of Harry a bit more about it, but thankfully, Professor Lupin walked up and put a stop to this potential fight once again. Now, it's key to note here that the only reason Draco knew this happened was because of Neville. He even mentions Neville told him, although I doubt it was Neville's intention that Draco would make fun of Harry for it. In the movie, Harry simply asks, "How did he find out?" And we never know. But the book gives this reasoning. Also, this is the first time Harry and Ron are actually arriving at Hogwarts properly, because their first year they were taken through the separate entrance to be sorted, and their second year they arrived in a flying car. Which brings us to the next omitted moment before the feast, which is McGonagall taking the trio to her office as they went into the castle. Soon after getting to her office, Madame Pomfrey arrived, and the two ladies asked Harry if he was okay and treated him as if he was mortally wounded. Harry insisted that he was fine and did not want to go to the hospital wing, but the others seemed to think he wasn't alright. Harry told Madame Pomfrey that Lupin gave him some chocolate, and she was happy that finally one of their Defense Against the Dark Arts professors knows what they're doing. After confirming Harry was alright, McGonagall sent Ron and Harry away and kept Hermione back to speak with her privately. And we don't learn the details of this conversation until much later, but spoiler, this is when McGonagall gives Hermione the time turner and discusses her class schedule with her. Finally, by the time they were able to get to the Great Hall, they had already missed the sorting, but they were just in time for Dumbledore's speech, in which he welcomed Professor Lupin and Hagrid as new teachers for that year. Plus, he gave the same warning about the Dementors as he does in the movie. And now, to wrap up our changes for this week's episode, there are two smaller differences regarding the final moments of our scenes this week. First, the fat lady portrait doesn't try to sing and not let them into their common room, but rather Percy takes them to the portrait and tells them the new password, Fortuna Major. J.K. Rowling writes that Neville sadly said, "Oh no," after hearing the password, as he had a habit of forgetting them. This is foreshadowing for a key detail later in the book, which was removed by the movie, but we'll get to that in a future episode. Lastly, the final change for this week is simply the fact that the candy scene with the boys hanging out in their dorm is made up. But I have no problems with this change, as it helps to embody the sentiment of the last line in the corresponding chapter, which is, they reached their familiar circular dormitory with its 5 four-poster beds, and Harry, looking around, felt he was home at last. It's hard to convey this feeling on screen, but this scene of Harry hanging out with his friends seems to do the trick, so I'm glad they added it. And on that uplifting note, that wraps up all of our changes for this week. So now that you've heard it all, I want to hear from you. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and check out the series playlist to catch up on any episodes you might have missed so far. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.